The canyon settlement was no place for a hatchling without a name that carried weight. Ash had a name, technically. The Clutch Elder had assigned it the way one assigns a number to a crate, functionally, without affection, because something had to be written in the ledger. She called him Ash because his scales came in gray and flaking, the color of a fire that burned poorly and gave little heat. It was not a cruel name on its surface, but the way she said it made it feel like a verdict. He had been 3 weeks old when his mother left. He would not learn the full story until much later, and even then it would come in pieces. A word here, an overheard conversation there, assembling itself slowly into a shape he could hold without it cutting him. What he knew in those earliest weeks was only the absence. A warm presence that had been there, and then was not. A scent he had barely begun to memorize, something like smoke and rain together, gone before it had the chance to mean home. She had taken a contract with a war campaign heading north. The warlord paid generously and asked nothing about personal circumstances, which was exactly the kind of arrangement that suited a dragon with ambitions and a hatchling she had not planned for. The Clutch Elder accepted a fee to take Ash in. It was a transaction, clean and documented. No one had asked Ash anything about it. So he woke each morning in the far corner of the Clutch Elder's den, where the warmth from the heat stones barely reached, and he watched her move through her routines with the particular awareness of a small creature who has learned to read the weather of the room. When her eyes landed on him, they carried the specific weight of inconvenience, not hatred, which would have at least been energetic, but something flatter and colder. Tolerance. The kind extended to a debt not yet paid off. He was 4 months old and had already understood, with the quiet devastation of the very young, that in the far corner of the Clutch Elder's den, beneath the flat sleeping stone that had been assigned to him without ceremony, Ash kept a hollow. It was small, just wide enough for a hatchling's foreleg to reach into without scraping, and he had found it by accident in his second week, pressing his nose along the base of the wall the way young dragons do when they are mapping the edges of an unfamiliar place. He had told no one about it. It was his first secret, and he guarded it with the seriousness of someone who had very little else to guard. Inside the hollow lived 4 things. The first was a wooden knight, no longer than his claw, carved from pale timber and painted in chipped red and gold. A merchant's child had dropped it near the canyon path and never come back for it. Ash had waited 3 days before taking it, which felt like the honorable amount of time. The second was a collection of painted river stones, 7 of them, each a different color, smooth and cool against his scales. He did not know who had painted them or why. He had found them scattered after a rainstorm, bright against the wet dirt, and gathered them one by one as though they were something that needed rescuing. The third was a red ball, rubber and slightly lopsided, left behind by another merchant's child, who had more toys than memory. It fit perfectly in the curve of his foreleg when he slept. The fourth was a carved fish, small and crude, made from dark wood. He had found this one in the ash pile behind the den, discarded, and he had cleaned it carefully with his tongue until it looked like something kept rather than thrown away. How every dragon in the canyon would have called these things worthless. Trinkets, debris. The Clutch Elder would have told him the space beneath the stone was wasted on nonsense. But at night, when the den went quiet and the cold crept in from the canyon walls, Ash would reach into the hollow and press his nose against each one in turn. The dry season arrived without apology, as it always did in the canyon, a slow tightening of the air, the water troughs dropping by inches each morning, the heat stones losing their warmth faster than usual because the nights turned sharp and mean. Food became a calculation. The Clutch Elder had never been generous, but she had maintained a grudging minimum. Scraps left at the edge of the communal plate, portions that said, "You are here," and therefore fed without saying anything warmer than that. Ash had accepted this arithmetic without complaint. He ate what was left, he did not ask for more, and he stayed small and quiet in his corner, the way a creature learns to stay when it understands that visibility is a risk. But when the dry season settled in fully, even the minimum disappeared. It was not announced, and there was no conversation, no explanation offered. One morning, the edge of the communal plate was simply clear, and Ash waited to see if it was an oversight, and the next morning it was clear again, and by the third morning he understood that the calculation had changed. There were more mouths, resources were tighter. The ledger had been reviewed and his entry had been quietly removed. He went back to his corner and sat for a long time without moving. Then he reached into the hollow beneath the sleeping stone and took out the wooden knight. He held it in both forepaws and looked at it the way you look at something you're trying to memorize. The chipped red paint along the shield. The pale timber showing through where the gold had worn away. The tiny, determined face of a figure going somewhere brave. He had carried it for 2 months. He had pressed his nose against it on the coldest nights and felt it give back something that cold could not touch. He looked at it for a long time. Then he tucked it under his foreleg, left the den before the clutch elder was awake, and walked the canyon path to the ridge market alone. The vendor was a stow. The flatbread came on the 8th day of the dry season, when the dried meat was gone and the hollow beneath the sleeping stone felt louder than it had before. Ash had not slept well the night prior. He had reached into the hollow twice in the dark, once around midnight, once just before dawn, not to take anything, just to press his nose against what remained. The painted stones were cool and smooth against his scales, each one a different color, each one gathered from the wet dirt after a rainstorm he still remembered clearly. He had cleaned every one of them with his tongue the day he found them. He had arranged them in the hollow by color, then rearranged them by size, then left them in the order he liked best, which was no particular order at all, but simply the way they had settled when he set them down and they felt right. He took them out in the gray early morning and laid them in a row on the sleeping stone. 7 stones, 7 colors. Each one smooth and quiet and entirely without use to anyone who needed to eat. He counted them twice. Then he wrapped them in the same leaf that had held the dried meat and walked back up the canyon path to the ridge market before he could change his mind, because he had learned already that changing his mind was a luxury that made the hunger louder. The vendor gave him a round of flatbread and a small clay cup of broth that was mostly hot water with salt and something vaguely green floating in it. It was not a generous exchange. Ash did not say so. He thanked her in the flat, careful way he had developed for transactions with adults, tucked the flatbread under his foreleg, sulked and carried the broth cup with both paws down the path without spilling a drop, because spilling felt like a catastrophe he could not afford. He ate the first quarter of the flatbread that evening, slowly, in small deliberate bites. He drank half the broth and set the rest against the heat stone to stay warm overnight. Each bite felt. The carved fish went on the 12th day. Ash did not let himself think about it too carefully, because thinking carefully had not helped with the night or the stones, and it would not help now. He took the fish from the hollow in the early morning, held it briefly, dark wood, crude shape, the one he had cleaned from the ash pile and made into something kept, and walked to the ridge market with the flat expression of someone conducting routine business. He got a handful of salted crackers and a strip of cured meat. He ate half of it that day and wrapped the rest in a leaf and did not look at the hollow when he got back. Only the red ball remained. He moved it from the hollow to the curve of his foreleg that same night, because the hollow felt wrong now. Too much empty space for one small thing to rattle around in. He slept with the ball pressed against his chest and woke with the faint impression of it in his scales. And that impression felt like something worth having, even if he could not explain why. The hunger was not subtle about what it wanted. It made itself known every morning with a clarity that left no room for argument, pressing against the inside of his ribs like a second heartbeat, rhythmic and insistent and entirely without patience for sentiment. Ash understood its logic. The red ball was tradable. The vendor would take it. It would become food, and food would become another day, and another day was the entire point. He knew this. He ran the arithmetic every morning with the same careful precision he had applied to every transaction since the dry season began. And every morning he tucked the ball back under his foreleg and walked out of the den and found another way. Scraps near the market bins, moisture licked from the canyon walls, the occasional charity of a vendor who looked at him a beat too long and pushed something across the board without making it a conversation. Some days the other way was barely enough. Some days Edric had not intended to walk down the back alley behind the lower market that afternoon. His original route had taken him past the lumber vendor, then the tool sharpener, then straight home before the evening light failed. A practical route, a familiar one, the kind a man walks without consulting his feet. But somewhere between the tool sharpener and the corner that turned toward home, he had heard a sound that stopped him. It was a scraping sound. Faint and rhythmic, coming from the narrow gap between two storage crates stacked against the market's back wall. The sound of something persistent and small, working away at a task with the focused patience of a creature that had no other options. He had assumed an animal. A stray cat, perhaps, or one of the ridge foxes that came down when the dry season pushed them toward the settlement's edges. He was not a man who walked past scraping sounds without checking. His daughter had trained that out of him 2 years ago, when she had discovered a trapped bird behind the woodpile and cried for an hour because he hadn't investigated sooner. So he turned, and he walked toward the crates, and he found the dragon hatchling. The hatchling was wedged into the gap between the crates with the practiced efficiency of something that had learned to use small spaces well. He was working his tongue methodically along the lower edge of the wood, collecting the thin film of moisture that condensed there in the late afternoon when the temperature began to drop. He did not stop when Edric's shadow fell across him. He finished the section he was working on first, which struck Edric as either very disciplined or very desperate, and then he raised his head and looked up with gray eyes that were older than they had any right to be. Edric looked back. He took in the details the way a carpenter takes in a piece of work, honestly, without flinching. The scales were gray and flaking at the edges, the color of wood left out knee. Most adults, in Ash's experience, did one of 3 things when they found him somewhere inconvenient. They told him to move along. They looked through him the way you look through something that doesn't quite register as a problem worth solving. Or they asked his clutch elder's name with the particular tone of someone preparing to report an infraction. He had cataloged these responses over months with the thoroughness of a creature building a survival manual, and he had learned to read the opening signs of each one. The posture, the expression, the quality of the silence before the first word came. This man did none of those things. He crouched first, which was unusual. Then, after a moment of looking at Ash with an expression that was difficult to categorize, he sat down fully on the dirt road, simply folded himself down and settled there, as though the ground were a perfectly reasonable place for a grown human to be, as though he had no particular dignity invested in staying above it. Ash stared at him. He ran through his mental catalog and found nothing that matched. He checked the man's hands. Empty. He checked his expression. Not the flat tolerance of the clutch elder, not the uncomfortable pity of market vendors who looked too long. Something else. Something that Ash did not have a file for yet, so he held very still and waited for the shape of it to become clear. The man looked back at him without rushing. The silence between them lasted long enough that Ash began constructing exit routes in his peripheral vision. The gap to the left of the far crate, the low crawl space beneath the market's back step. Not because he had decided to use them, but because knowing they were there made the staying feel less like a trap. Then the man spoke. "Are you hungry?" 3 words, quiet and direct, with no architecture of obligation built into them. "No, I'll help you if..." "No, you should really be." No performance of generosity that required an... The silence after the question sat between them for a moment longer than was comfortable. Ash looked at the man on the dirt road. He looked at the gap beside the far crate. He looked back at the man who had not moved, had not shifted his expression toward impatience, had simply left the question where he had set it, and was waiting with the unhurried stillness of someone who had nowhere more important to be. Ash understood transactions. He understood that nothing came without an exchange, that the world ran on a ledger and every entry had a corresponding cost, and that kindness from strangers was either a mistake or a preamble. He had learned this not from being told, but from the accumulated evidence of 4 months of living inside it, every lesson written in the currency of things he had loved and given away. So he reached under his foreleg and took out the red ball. He held it out with both paws, level and steady, the way he had held out the wooden knight and the painted stones and the carved fish, with the careful dignity of someone conducting a fair exchange, someone who understood the terms and was meeting them without complaint. His paws did not shake. He had decided before he extended them that they would not shake, because shaking would have meant something about the ball that he was not prepared to say out loud. Everything in him knew what this was. The last thing. The one he had chosen, every morning for weeks, overeating. The small red worn rubber weight that had pressed against his chest in the dark and made the ember stay lit when the canyon went cold and quiet and entirely indifferent to whether he made it to morning. He held it out and kept his face still and waited for the transaction to complete. Edric looked at the ball for a long moment. Then he looked at Ash, at his steady pause, at his carefully arranged expression, at the too visible spine and the dull scales in the gray eyes that were doing an admirable and heartbreaking. The question came out smaller than Ash intended. He had meant it to sound practical, a request for information, a reasonable inquiry into the terms of an arrangement he did not yet understand. But it came out with an edge of something unguarded in it, something that had slipped through the careful architecture he maintained around himself in the presence of strangers. The two words hung in the alley air between them, and Ash wished briefly that he could take them back and reissue them in a steadier voice. Then why? Not even a full question. More like the exposed end of a much longer one he did not know how to finish. Why would you? Why should you? Why me? Why now? Why without wanting something back? Why in the way that doesn't feel like a transaction waiting to reveal its true cost? Edric looked at him for a moment with that same unclassifiable expression. Then he said it. Because you're hungry and I have food. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather or the position of the sun, simply without decoration, without the performance of virtue that usually accompanied generosity from strangers. No pause before it to indicate he was saying something meaningful. No emphasis after it to make sure Ash understood how generous he was being. Just the sentence, clean and unadorned, dropped into the space between them like something that required no further explanation because it contained all the explanation there was. And then he stood up from the dirt road, brushed the dust from the back of his trousers with two efficient strokes, and started walking toward the market stalls without looking back to check if Ash was coming. Not in the way of someone indifferent to whether he followed, but in the way of someone who had made the invitation clear and was extending the quiet courtesy of not making it into a moment that required a formal decision. Ash stood in the alley with the red ball still in his paws. He looked at the man's retreating. Edric's house was at the end of a short lane, modest and well-kept in the way of a person who understood the relationship between care and longevity. The door frame fitted cleanly, the window shutters hung straight, the small front steps swept clear of the canyon dust that settled on everything else in the settlement by late afternoon. Ash stopped at the threshold. Not from reluctance, exactly. More from the instinct of a creature who had learned to pause at entrances and take a full accounting of what lay beyond them before committing to the crossing. He stood on the front step and looked into the warm interior and processed it in the systematic way he processed all new spaces. Exits, layout, the positions of things, the general temperature of the room. He did not get very far with this assessment, because the small human girl inside the house had already seen him. She came across the room at a speed that suggested she had been waiting, specifically, for something exactly like this to happen. And she arrived at the doorway with her hands clasped and her eyes very wide and an expression of absolute, uncomplicated delight that Ash had never once in his life had directed at him before, and did not know how to receive. She was 7 years old and small for it, with her father's broad, honest face in miniature and dark hair that had been braided and had mostly escaped the braid and seemed unbothered by this. She looked at Ash the way Ash had looked at the painted river stones the morning he found them, like something that had been missing from the world and had now, correctly, been returned to it. "No, he can sleep by the hearth," she told her father, with the decisive authority of someone issuing a ruling that was not open to amendment. "It's the warmest spot and he needs it." She had not asked whether Ash was staying. The question did not appear to exist for her. Then she looked directly at Ash, with the frank and total attention of a 7-year-old. The first week was its own particular kind of difficult. Not difficult in the way the dry season had been difficult. That had been a clean and honest difficulty, hunger and cold, and the straightforward arithmetic of survival. This was harder to name. It lived in the small moments, the unguarded ones, the spaces between things where Ash's body continued operating according to a set of rules that no longer applied and had not yet received the information. Edric moved quickly on the second morning, reaching past Ash for a tool on the workbench. Nothing alarming, a perfectly ordinary reach, and Ash was against the far wall before he had decided to move. He stood there for a moment with his back pressed to the plaster and his heart doing something loud and unnecessary. And then he looked at what had actually happened, which was a man picking up a hammer, and he felt the heat of shame move through him from his spine to the tips of his ears. Edric said nothing. He picked up the hammer and went back to his work with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything. and the moment passed without being made into one. At meals, Ash ate too fast. He knew he was doing it while he was doing it. The months of rationing had left a reflex that did not trust the food to still be there in 5 minutes, and his body acted on that distrust before his mind could intervene. He would finish in minutes, and then sit with the empty plate and the awareness of what he had done, and feel the shame settle over him like a second skin. Edric adjusted the portions. He said nothing about the speed. He simply began leaving a small additional amount set to the side of Ash's plate. Visible, accessible, not presented as a correction but simply as a fact of the meal, so that Ash could see, concretely and without having to take anyone's word for it, that there was more if the first was not enough. It was such a small thing. It undid something in Ash that he hadn't known was wild. It happened on a Tuesday evening, which was unremarkable in every other respect. Edric was in the workshop finishing a cabinet order that was due by the end of the week, the sound of his plane moving in long, steady strokes coming through the wall in a rhythm that Ash had come to associate with the particular piece of a house where someone is productively occupied. The hearth was going quietly. The canyon outside had settled into its evening stillness. Mira had appointed herself the keeper of Ash's sleeping area, with the same unilateral authority she had applied to everything else regarding his presence in the house, which meant she straightened his blanket every evening before bed with the serious attention of someone performing a task that genuinely mattered. She had never asked if he wanted this done. It had simply begun happening. Ani and Ash had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not mind. He was watching her from across the room when it happened. She lifted the corner of the blanket to smooth it flat, and the red ball rolled out from where it had been tucked against the edge of the sleeping stone and came to rest against her knee. She picked it up with both hands the way children pick up things that interest them, immediately, without hesitation, turning it over to examine it from multiple angles. Ash went very still. He watched her look at the ball with the focused seriousness she brought to all assessments, the small frown of genuine consideration, the slight tilt of her head. He watched her test its weight in her palms. He watched her look at the worn surface, the slight lopsidedness, on the particular shade of red that had faded slightly on one side from months of being pressed against his scales in the dark. He did not reach for it. He held himself carefully in place and waited for whatever came next with the braced stillness of someone who has learned that the things they love are negotiable. Mira looked up at him. Good red. Edric was not a man who made announcements about the things he intended to do. He had learned this about himself early in his life and had made his peace with it. He was better with his hands than with declarations, more comfortable with the quiet work of fixing something than with the ceremony of announcing it was broken. His daughter had inherited this quality selectively, keeping the directness and discarding the quiet, which produced a particular combination that he found both exhausting and deeply reassuring. He had noticed the scales on the first evening. Not just the color, which was the obvious thing, but the texture, the way the edges lifted slightly, the dullness that sat over them like a film, the absence of the natural oils that gave healthy dragon scales their faint reflective quality. He had seen something similar once before, years ago, in a hatchling at the canyon market whose clutch had gone through a bad drought season. He remembered the healer's explanation with the clarity of someone who files information away without knowing why until the why becomes apparent. So he went to the Dragon Quarter healer 3 days after Ash arrived, in the early morning before the workshop opened, and he asked his questions plainly and listened to the answers with the focused attention he gave to any problem he intended to solve properly. The healer told him what he needed to know. Poor nutrition in the early months. Insufficient protein, not enough sunlight. And something else. Something the healer mentioned almost as an aside, in the manner of someone sharing information they consider obvious but have learned to include anyway. Consistent positive engagement. Daily, genuine. The kind that tells a young creature's body, in whatever language bodies understand, that remaining alive is a worthwhile project. Edric thanked her and went home, and adjusted the meals that evening without explanation or announcement. More protein in the evening porties. It was a quiet evening in the 4th month, the kind that arrives without agenda. Mira had gone to bed early after a long day at school that she had described in exhaustive detail over dinner, and then fallen asleep mid-sentence on the hearthside cushion, which Edric had handled with the practiced efficiency of a father, who has carried a sleeping child to bed more times than he can count. The house had settled into the particular stillness that follows a child's bedtime. Deeper than ordinary quiet, the kind that has texture to it. Edric came back to the main room and sat in his chair by the hearth with a cup of tea and said nothing for a while, which was not unusual. Ash was on his sleeping stone, the red ball in his paws, doing the thing he sometimes did in the evenings where he was not quite awake and not quite elsewhere, and just present in the warm room in a way that required nothing of him. It was Edric who spoke first. "You did well," he said. "Before, on your own." He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without the throat clearing that usually signals a person preparing to deliver something significant. Just the statement, offered into the quiet of the room like a log set onto a fire. Matter of fact, considered, the kind of thing a person says when they have been thinking it for some time and have finally found the right evening for it. Ash looked at him. The words moved through him in a complicated way. He turned them over, the way Mira had turned the red ball over, examining them from multiple angles, feeling for the place where they didn't hold. He found himself wanting to correct them, the way you correct a sum that has come out wrong, because the conclusion did not match the evidence he had catalogued. "I gave everything away," he said. It was not self-pity. It was accounting. He had owned 4 things and he had traded 3 of them for food, and he had come very close on several mornings to trading the 4th. The wooden box had been Mira's idea, as most of the better things in the house were. She had produced it one afternoon from her room with the air of someone presenting a solution to a problem they had been quietly working on, setting it down in front of Ash with both hands and the serious expression she reserved for offerings she considered important. It was a good box, small and square, made from pale timber, with a fitted lid that closed cleanly and a small brass latch that caught with a satisfying click. Edric had made it years ago for her collection of interesting rocks, which had since migrated to a shelf, leaving the box available for reassignment. "For your things," Mira had said, as though it were obvious, and as though Ash having a place for his things was a fact of the household that had simply been waiting for the right container. He had put the red ball in first. Then Mira had added 3 river stones she had collected from the creek on a school walk, chosen, she explained, for their colors. 1 green-gray, 1 with a faint orange stripe, 1 that was almost entirely white. She set them in with the careful placement of someone arranging something that should look right, and stood back and assessed, and apparently the assessment was satisfactory because she nodded once and left him to it. The carved dragon had come from Edric, produced one slow afternoon from a piece of dark timber left over from a cabinet order, small and unhurried, mid-stride, going somewhere with the quiet confidence of a creature that knows where it is headed. He had set it on Ash's sleeping stone without ceremony and gone back to the workshop, and Ash had held it for a long time before placing it in the box beside the ball and the stones. 4 things again. Different things. Things that had been given rather than found, offered rather than traded for, placed in his keeping by people who expected nothing back. He had latched the box carefully the first few nights,